So I'm an assistant professor of information studies at the University of Maryland. Prior to that, I was at Microsoft Research New England, and I'm a sociologist of labor and technology. One of my collaborators in one of these papers joked that it was pretty funny that I was invited here today to the center because as a Marxist, I obviously have no ethics, and that there's really no reason I should be here. But I do here want to take a materialist approach to talking about where exactly the latest ethical boom comes from. And before that, I want us to come to a common understanding about the harms that we're addressing. So we've seen a lot of prominent machine learning screw-ups in the past few years, moments where automated pattern discrimination goes wrong. Things like computer vision systems labeling black folks as gorillas. Things like what Virginia Eubanks showed, that the automated review of Medicaid applications in Indiana during the Daniels administration flagged any discrepancy in documentation as a failure to cooperate, which booted around 1 million people, largely disabled folks, from their health care. And we saw that ProPublica found that the risk score algorithm Compass, used in Broward County, Florida to inform bail decisions, had equal error rates for black and white defendants compared to future arrests, but was twice as likely to label black defendants as future criminals compared to white ones. So equal error rates in opposite directions. Why does this keep happening? And the deeper question, why do we feel like this is wrong? That is some sort of violation of the social contract that is different from dumb, biased humans making dumb, biased, bad decisions. What's weird or different about this? So my interest in machine learning and AI is not in particular technical advances or performance benchmarks, or really in philosophical questions about what makes our brains different from machines. Instead, I'm interested in two things. First, the politics of bureaucracy, how decisions in large organizations get made, and how that changes people's lives in ways they may not even understand. You know, sometimes that's a human process, sometimes it's a technical one, but usually it's both, and it's been that way for a few centuries now. And second, I'm interested in the sociology of ethics. Not normative comparisons of different ethical models, but an explanation for why certain modes of ethical reasoning gain traction when and where they do. And this is what my title means here. The problems of machine learning are made by people, and so are the ethical responses to them. Both are the products of political struggle, and both can be changed by those same struggles. This talk draws from years of research and collaboration with brilliant colleagues of mine in industry, academe, and activism, like computer scientist and entrepreneur Genevieve Patterson, organizer and political theorist Sarah Hamid, philosopher Anna Lauren Hoffman, and historian of science Luke Stark. In particular, this talk draws from an IEEE Spectrum article that I wrote with Genevieve last year and a conference paper I wrote with Luke and Anna, and both are available on my website. So I'm going to talk for 45 minutes-ish and then take questions. So first I'm going to talk about what it looks like when machine learning deployments go wrong, and my interest here is in building a schema to classify the different kinds of harm that ML systems visit upon people so that we have a shared vocabulary to define the problem. Second, drawing on the work of sociologist Gabriella Bend, I'll explore the dominant response to these problems, proposals for the ethical design of AI and ML. And my solution here, or my interest here, is largely descriptive, not normative. I want to understand what people mean when they say that the solution to broken systems for hiring or bail or whatever is to build more ethical machine learning systems. You know, how, after all, can a model be ethical? Where does that belief come from at the end of the day? Finally, I'll compare the movement for ethical design with nascent activist alternatives in the labor movement, Black Lives Matter, and immigrant rights organizing that attack the exact same problems with very different language. Defining a problem, of course, also defines its solutions. So we know that, for example, defining the racial achievement gap in educational test scores, saying that's a problem of instruction suggests certain solutions. You know, you got to train teachers better, you got to link their salaries to the test scores. But if we define that as a problem of poverty, that suggests other solutions. You know, you give free meals, free laptops, whatever. How we define the problem defines our solutions. And my goal for tonight is for us to ask together, what kinds of political problems does the automated classification of people and the prediction of their behavior, broken or not, pose for us as a society? And how do we as a society come together to agree or at least fight over a definition of that problem? So we had an AI boom before in the 60s and 70s, followed by a long AI winter. The first boom tried to build AI, this is a massive oversimplification, in a manner largely analogous to Chomsky's universal grammar, coding the millions of rules that say a conversation would require. This failed. Our present boom is owed largely to two advances: a set of researchers, especially in Canada, thank you, who kept up with AI through the winter and developed techniques that we today call neural networks that mimic brain behavior by learning from large data sets to develop pattern discrimination rules for particular domains. We have also come upon the availability of many large data sets to train those neural networks, thanks, example, to Facebook, for example, where everyone will label millions of photos with their content for free. We also now have the means to store that data. So now we have the talent, the power, and the data through which we can develop machine learning models that either act on rules we establish in advance, supervised learning, or through rules they develop as they proceed, unsupervised learning. This is a massive technical advance, and it's not surprising that it's been integrated into a host of different social domains. But we keep seeing these mistakes, and sometimes, especially for something like healthcare, it has life and death consequences. So why do these mistakes keep happening, and how can we categorize their failures and their harm? So I want to talk about the different types of harm that can come from machine learning with headlines from the news, but also with one extended example that shows how one system can break in different ways. And this system was the focus of me and Genevieve's Spectrum article. So you're all probably familiar with the company Taser that made stun guns for police. Taser rebranded as Axon a few years ago, and they own most of the body camera market in the US. The actual body camera hardware is just a few $100, so the big money is in long-term subscription services. The way Axon sells that to police departments is by saying, you buy our body cameras and we'll store that footage, we'll help you develop permissions for who can see it, and we'll automatically redact it with your help. So basically the officer draws a box around the face of someone that they want to redact, and then the computer vision software tracks that box throughout the footage so that their face is not visible. Axon also promises in the future that having learned from these millions of annotations that police make on body camera video for police reports, their detailed annotations, that Axon will automatically generate police reports from that footage, thus eliminating the tedious paperwork that police hate. What could possibly go wrong? So this is the place where policing and big tech meet, and because of it, Axon has been the focus of a lot of activist protests. Because of this, they recently said that they will not be introducing face matching technology into their body cameras at this time, though of course face detection obviously still has to exist for redaction purposes. So politics is a social system of collective deliberation, right? Decision making. And it's also a system of collective distribution, resource matching. Like any political problem, I think you can broadly group the harms of broken machine learning systems into outcome harms, the results of a decision, and process harms, how the decision was made. So the first outcome harm is misrecognition, when an institution fails to recognize you or recognizes you in a way you would not prefer. So whether the state would recognize gay folks' marriages as legitimate is a good example of meat space recognition harms. Whether Google Images calls black people people or gorillas is a good example of computer vision misrecognition. The explanation for the latter is probably pretty simple. Of the millions of faces that this was trained to recognize, it probably had far fewer black faces compared to white faces, especially in the great lighting that we associate with professional photography, and so it overgeneralized and thought black people were the same as apes. And this is a vicious insult. It is perhaps not deliberate, but it is also not accidental. We should know our training data, and we should know that these blind spots are probably pretty telling about what works at Google and how. How might this repeat with police body camera data? We can imagine that the training data includes high-profile arrests with extensive detail For example, on people that wore masks during a big robbery that required a lot of police to converge on the situation. If that data does not also include women wearing burqas, and thus cannot distinguish between a balaclava and a burqa, then automated police reports might label burqas as masks, leading officers to treat Muslim women with greater suspicion than they already do. The second outcome harm is misallocation, when an institution does not fairly distribute its stuff. And we could think here about the long history of environmental racism in the US and Canada, where highways and garbage dumps are more likely to be near Black and Native communities than white ones. Because machine learning is often deployed as a pattern discrimination technique, it's a category machine, the harms of misallocation flow naturally from the harms of misrepresentation. ProPublica's story on Compass is a really great example here. The harm of misclassifying Black defendants as more likely to recidivate than white defendants, even when controlling for their records, creates a new harm, different jail times and different bail amounts. Similarly, in our burqa example, the misclassification of burqas as balaclavas leads to misallocation, more intensive police attention to Muslim women. This, of course, is the same thing the NYPD is currently being sued for, just faster, with a veneer of technological objectivity. The second set of harms are less about the results of a decision and more about how it gets made. And this is the core of democracy. It's a fair, arguably, and open, in theory, process of deliberation. We live, supposedly, in representative democracies where some people make decisions for us, but they are supposed to offer an explanation of it, and if we don't like that explanation, we can call them to account. It's not really important, for example, whether a judge believes deep in their heart that every word of their written verdict is true when they issue a decision. What's important is that that verdict is public, and thus people can appeal that verdict based on the reasoning therein. It's a receipt. And one of the primary concerns of machine learning systems is that they are often black boxes that don't give receipts. We don't know often how they come to their decisions, that's part of the magic, especially in unsupervised systems, because they don't think the same way that we do. We know the inputs, we know the outputs, but replicating the path from A to B is sometimes quite difficult. This is a vibrant field of UX research right now, developing more accountable, interpretable systems. It is, of course, an open debate whether accountable or interpretable systems are a good thing. And that lack of explicability is a technical problem. We need systems to produce receipts in order to hold them to account. But it is compounded by a legal problem. Privately contracted systems used by public agencies are nevertheless the property of that original private company, at least in the US, and thus the reasoning by which the machine reached its decision is often protected as a trade secret, irrespective of any engineering decisions made in its design. So a Wisconsin defendant named Eric Loomis sued the state because he thought the use of the Compass risk score algorithm used as an advisory tool by the judge who gave him 6 years violated his rights to due process. He didn't know how that decision was made, and no one else did either. The state said that process was a trade secret, and thus Loomis had no standing to sue. He lost, and he's in prison. So these decisions are both technically and legally opaque. And of course, bureaucrats or cops make bad decisions all the time and might not be able to give a great account of them. But at least they can be called to the stand and forced to testify. Compass cannot. In our hypothetical Axon example, for example, we could imagine a class action lawsuit against the company for its automated suspicion of women in burqas being refused certification by an appeals court, both because no explanation is forthcoming and because any explanation is protected by trade secrecy privileges. Finally, there's a process harm in speed, which denies appeal just by merit of skipping over the time in which you can appeal something. Much of democracy is quite slow, and this can be very frustrating, and frankly, it can sometimes be harmful. But often things happen slowly in order to get maximum input, and to open any decisions up to appeal by the affected parties. Automated pattern recognition for political decision-making necessarily occurs too fast for the affected parties, much less regulators who want to intervene. And that's some part of the sell sometimes. Humans can't get everything together really fast. You'd like to make that decision quicker. In many cases, that's often a good thing. This, of course, was the harm that Virginia Eubanks found in the automated processing of Medicaid applications in Indiana a few years ago. Any mistake in the form meant the form was automatically rejected as a failure to comply. And this certainly made the processing of paperwork much, much faster. There's no gray area. You just don't get your benefits. But at least when things were done by slow, stupid humans, you could call them and ask for an explanation. Axon's pitch to police is that it will eventually eliminate the tedium of paperwork, and that sounds great because it frees people up to maybe do more of their job if you think police should be doing more of that job. But that paperwork has an important political function because every memo is a moment of accountability in which an officer must stop and consider how and why a decision was made. It is also a point of intervention for superiors or regulators or activists or citizens. The threat of further paperwork can often be an accountability measure in and of itself. And this is one reason why it's been such a long fight in my city, in DC, to have our local police release data on who they stop and frisk, when, where, and why. We finally won that fight, but it was a big fight because each slowdown is a point of consideration for whether or not something is just or necessary. So that's the problem as I see it. There are these harms and outcomes and process that machine learning implementations in public agencies have wrought, and it is these harms that have provoked a ton of research and activism and soul searching among people designing these systems and people clamoring for solutions to these problems. The 2016 election and the specter of fake news, which seems to be kind of how we operationalize the crisis of faith in liberal democracies, is also a big one. This is the thing that makes everyone realize that there's a problem there and we need to fix it. And over the last 3 years, one big trend has emerged as a solution to these problems. A movement for the ethical design of AI and ML that presupposes that a lack of ethical training and ethical consideration in the design and implementation of these systems causes negative political outcomes. Indeed, Axon itself created an ethics board with outside experts in robotics, policing, law, and computer vision to show how serious it was about this problem. And in my remaining time, I want to explore how these technologists and these regulators have defined this problem and what they mean when they say we need ethical AI and ML. Because again, that is a non-obvious solution to me. There are other ways to define this problem, but this is how we're defining it right now. Here, I'm particularly inspired by the work of sociologist Gabriela Bend, who studies what he calls the moral background. And this is what we can think of as kind of like the second order of ethical thinking behind the first order norms and ideas and examples that we usually use in our day-to-day language. Beyond the content of specific values or norms, and more like the grammar that specifies the type of ethical reasoning we use, the language and examples we draw on, that sort of thing. And in this way, I'm asking what kind of problem ethical machine learning is and what solutions flow from that framing. And I'll conclude by offering some alternatives. So obviously, there's a long history of professional ethics in fields like engineering, architecture, law, and medicine. But I think, especially in the US, we can trace the present ethics bonanza to the Obama administration. So from 2014 to 2016, Obama and the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy identified big data. Remember big data? We don't really do that anymore. But big data was pretty cool for a couple of years there. Anyway, so the Obama team identifies this as a strategic priority and an area of legal and ethical concern. And then in a series of reports, the administration makes a commitment to support big data's, quote, enormous potential for positive impact while also, quote, ensuring that it does not create unintended discriminatory consequences. And these reports frame concerns over discrimination explicitly within the context of US civil rights legislation, focusing on algorithmic systems and automated processes that, quote, inform decisions that affect our lives, such as whether or not we qualify for credit or employment, or which financial, employment, and housing advertisements we see. And the experts that were involved in all these different reports would go on to found many of the organizations or work on the ethics manifestos that we know today. And the examples that OSTP brought up still dominate the conversation. The threat of automated jobs, the automated decisions that are black boxes, all the trolley problems, the fairness or unfairness of black box decisions like Compass. This is the vocabulary that we then go on to use elsewhere. Since then, and picking up pace especially in the last 2 years, we've seen an incredible amount of debate over what it means to build ethical AI or ML. There's been an explosion of think tanks like OpenAI or AI Now, conferences like FatML, now FatStar, corporate advisory bodies like the Partnership on AI to Benefit People in Society, or Axon's AI Ethics Board for Public Safety. We have internal corporate ethics statements from Google and Microsoft, new nonprofit ventures like the Montreal Declaration on ML and Human Rights, new academic units like MIT's Schwarzman College that try to build ethics in from the ground up. And then we have an explosion of required ethics classes in CS, and on and on and on and on and on. Everyone wants ethics. It is not, however, entirely clear that we all agree on what ethical machine learning means. For example, Joy Buolamwini is a brilliant grad student at MIT, and Timmy Gebru, a similarly brilliant researcher who I believe is at Google right now, wrote an excellent and highly publicized paper called Gender Shades that everyone should read that demonstrates the failure of ML-driven facial recognition technologies to recognize people of color, especially black folks. And they argue that, this was from the New York Times coverage of their research, quote, "You can't have ethical AI that's not inclusive, and whoever is creating the technology is setting the standards." Responding on Twitter, sociologist Alondra Nelson, president of the Social Science Research Council, noted that while algorithmic accountability is important, quote, "I struggle to understand why we want to make black communities more cognizant in facial recognition systems that are disproportionately used for surveillance." So where Buolamwini's quote framed inclusion as a fix to faulty technical systems, Nelson framed inclusion as a threat to black communities that are historically targeted by surveillance technology. And after all, the major enterprise use case for facial recognition is not Snapchat filters, it's border control, surveillance cameras, stuff like that. So there's clearly a disagreement over what it means to build an ethical system here. We know it needs ethics, we don't know exactly what that means. And this, of course, is a far cry from earlier eras of debate over the ethical responsibilities of scientists and technologists. So when Karl Popper gives a lecture to the International Congress of Philosophy in Vienna in 1968, he begins by noting that everyone in the room is perfectly clear before he even opens his mouth that his title, The Moral Responsibility of the Scientist, was, quote, "a euphemism for the issue of biological and nuclear warfare." So the gravity of these technologies helped focus the minds of attendees. And this kind of shared consensus on the moral responsibility of computer engineers and data scientists towards their own inventions does not hold today. We can't even agree on the problem, much less how to solve it. But we're starting to try. And we have this burgeoning movement that me and my colleagues call ethical design, and is it attempting to foster this consensus in machine learning, or at least formalize the terms of the debate, generate something like a moral background. So last year, we collected the 7 most prominent value statements in ethical AI and ML meant to guide their development, implementation, and regulation. The oldest, from OpenAI, was from December 2015. The newest, the Toronto Declaration, was from May 2018. Some of these take the form of lengthy legal declarations. Others are descriptions of problem spaces and the projects that those bodies will pursue in those spaces. Some are sponsored by Amazon or Axon. Others are a collection of lawyers and interdisciplinary scholars. And this past year, we've been updating that analysis for the next paper with another dozen or so ethics statements from big firms like Google, who released one after the Maven protests, or big institutions like the EU. So how do these manifestos define what kind of problem AI or ML poses, and what kind of solution should ethical design be? What are the assumptions that ground these efforts? What are the norms that they suggest? And the first thing to note here is that the legitimation of design as a site of ethical inquiry. So for STS people like me, who are used to complaining for many, many years that technology is not neutral, and we are used to being ignored when we say that, this is a very big deal. It is a welcome development. It is clear to everyone involved in this conversation, for the most part, that designers' values matter because they end up in the design. And this is most obvious with the training data examples, right? Like, it is impossible to say that these are neutral tools where you can use them however you want if the training data that goes into a particular ML solution determines what it's used for and how it's used down the road. That's just a tool, you can do whatever you want with it, has largely disappeared. And for STS people like me, yay, hooray, big win. although we'll revisit that in a second. Building from that, we found 7 main themes in these ethics manifestos. So first, while statements differ as to why AI and ML are matters of ethical concern, all agree that A, their positive and negative impacts are a matter of universal concern, B, there is a shared language of ethical concern across the human species, and C, these concerns can be addressed objectively by measuring their impact in the real world. And often this ethical universalism is justified by reference to a kind of hazy biological community. So the core argument of the Center for Humane Technology, for example, which is largely made up of former Facebook and Google designers, is that these social media are hacking our attention, that human brains cannot adequately cope with these addictive designs. So there's a lot of cartoon brain stuff on their website. Second, and despite assuming a universal community of ethical concern, these vision statements are not mass mobilization documents. They frame ethical design as a project of expert oversight, wherein primarily technical and secondarily legal experts come together to articulate their concerns and implement primarily technical and secondarily legal solutions. So in describing their work, the Partnership on AI separates out engagement of experts, scientists, builders, from engagement of other stakeholders, individuals and organizations disrupted by AI. Experts make AI happen, other stakeholders have AI happen to them. Third, these envisioning documents all offer deterministic framings of AI and ML as inevitable world historical shifts. Paradoxically, AI and ML are also at the same time described as values-driven, insofar as human beings create them. They are forces to which we must adapt, and forces for which we are also responsible. The Montreal Declaration captures this tension really well. So there are sections headed by specific values such as justice that veer between instrumental impact, e.g., what types of discrimination could AI create or exacerbate? And on the other hand, there's a lot of active human agency. Should the development of AI be neutral, or should it seek to reduce social and economic inequality? So it's taken as a given that AI and ML are coming, and they will replace a broad swath of human jobs and decisions. Consequently, ethical debate is largely limited to how to design and implement these systems. And this perhaps resolves that tension of values-driven determinism, okay? So human agency is integral to ethical design, but it is largely a property of those expert humans who are responsible for designing the thing in the first place. Fourth, and proceeding nicely from values-driven determinism, we find that these value statements focus primarily on design as the locus of ethical scrutiny, to the exclusion of business practices. And this is not particularly unique in the history of business ethics, but it's important here because the cutting edge of the field is, due to the enormous amount of money necessary to train AI, store data, and implement code, largely the province of those giant companies that are funding, for example, the Partnership on AI or OpenAI, who also have a habit of acquiring smaller upstarts. The market is quite concentrated. Fifth, an important consequence of business practices being off the table is the implication that better building is the only way forward. So we hear a lot of affirmative statements about what AI or ML should do, but very few red lines about what it should not do. For example, Axon's ethics board frames their initiative as the kind of responsible shepherding of innovations that are just destined to improve policing. CEO Rick Smith said that the ethics board was created, quote, to ensure any AI technology in public safety is developed responsibly. In a comment to the Washington Post, Smith echoed that kind of values-driven determinism by saying, quote, it would be both naive and counterproductive to say law enforcement should not have these technologies. But Axon's ethics board has no veto power. Feedback from the ethics board did, however, lead to Exxon recently saying that they will not include any face matching technology in their product at this time, although they do need face recognition for redaction. But that's not a legally binding decision, it's just an internal policy debate. 6, these values manifestos seek to keep the conversation going. They want to engage as many stakeholders, again, largely experts, as possible. This positions ethical design as ethical because it is given a thorough vetting. Vetting legitimates decisions through an appeal to transparency, but without specifying any subsequent substantive commitment. You just got to talk to everyone, but what happens next? Whatever. This legitimacy holds even if, as in Axon's case, the consulted stakeholders are very limited in their capacity to impact design. And indeed, it appears that part of the mission of Axon's ethics board is to simply release reports that, quote, demonstrate a commitment to public transparency. Finally, in our last theme, the broad circle of expert consultation is also extended to ML technologies themselves. Vision statements position explicable and transparent systems in opposition to black-boxed ones. And this is both a foundation of moral ML and a means by which moral questions are pursued. So under the Montreal Declaration's knowledge value, there are questions posed not just about what AI means for human knowledge. Does the development of AI put critical thinking at risk? But what knowledge humans should have about AI. Is it acceptable not to be informed that medical or legal advice was provided by a chatbot? So this dual emphasis makes clear that the proposed principle that follows the development of AI should promote critical thinking and protect us from propaganda and manipulation. It is a two-way street. Moral machines shield us from fake news, but they also make their inner workings clear enough to ensure that there's no fake news inside. So we identified 7 core elements of ethical design's moral background: universal concerns, objectively measured, expert oversight, values-driven determinism, design as a locus of ethical scrutiny, better building, stakeholder-driven legitimacy, and machine translation. What unites all of these together? 2 big things stand out. First, conversations around the design and deployment of ethical AI and ML are taking place among experts well aware that they are under public scrutiny. The prospect of massive job losses and rigged elections has raised the public profile of their work. Construction of a moral background for ethical design is partly about generating the moral consensus that Karl Popper knew existed on nuclear and biological weapons, agreement over what the threats are, who should respond, and how. The problem remains, in this view, fundamentally technical, secondarily legal, shielded from democratic intervention, the inevitable result of progress. Second, and perhaps to the surprise of critical researchers engaged in this work for decades, like myself, like many of you, excuse me, ethical design seems to share many conceptual similarities with fields like science and technology studies. So Fatstar's principles for accountable algorithms, which was drawn from a Dagstall seminar held a couple of years ago, makes it clear that, quote, algorithms and the data that drive them are designed and created by people. There is always a human ultimately responsible for decisions made or informed by an algorithm. And this paints a very clear picture of moral causation. Bad ethics leads to bad design, which leads to bad outcomes. And again, this is a non-obvious conclusion. One could just as easily blame monopolistic business practices, or just like the sheer chaos that comes from all these dumb machines interacting in a way that we couldn't predict. You don't have to make ethics the story, but ethics has become the story. And this presents a new problem for social scientists like me, who are frankly used to being ignored. What if, instead of being brushed aside, our critiques are being heard, but transformed into something we may not recognize? I love these. There's like millions and millions. You search like AI and cognition, and there's a million of these going on. Like this stuff. I love this stuff. Someone write a paper about that, please. So what we've seen here is this burgeoning effort to define the moral background of ethical design. It's still in flux. Obviously, it's still being formed, but at this stage, it looks like this. People are gonna lose their jobs. Parole and credit is gonna get dictated by algorithm. That's inevitable. What we need is a set of responsible technicians and lawyers who can make that algorithm legible to the people it affects and minimize the damage it produces without cutting too much into the bottom line. But precisely because these ethical rules are up for grabs, Me and my co-authors think this is a valuable moment to learn from other movements who are also trying to minimize the damage of AI and ML, but are using very different ideas from professional ethics. What might this look like? 2 examples by way of conclusion. So the Black Lives Matter movement was kicked off in 2013 by Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi after George Zimmerman's acquittal for the murder of Trayvon Martin. The Movement for Black Lives policy platform, which everybody should read, provides a useful contrast to ethical design manifestos. It's the usual policy platform. It's just, a lot of boring detail on like county level, state level, and national decisions and suggestions for how activists should react to them. But it clearly defines their project as an abolitionist one. They organize politically to create a world where police and prisons, violent institutions that are often quite bad at solving social problems, become unnecessary. So it is both about taking something away and building something to replace them so that they do not need to come back. And under the manifesto section entitled An End to Mass Surveillance of Black Communities and the End to the Use of Technologies that Criminalize and Target Our Communities, the policy platform addresses many of the same technologies that all these ethics manifestos address. But instead, they frame the solution as increased democratic oversight of technological procurement by police departments. This abolitionist perspective differs from ethical design in at least 2 ways. First, the project of defining harm and redress takes a much longer view, which denies any possibility of a universal ethical community. So while everyone might benefit, this is clearly a historically specific problem, especially affecting Black folks. Second, rather than starting with the principles you think will move the world forward, the M4BL platform starts with its vision of the good life, abolition, and it works backwards from there, identifying general principles and the specific fights with specific people that those principles imply. This is a mass mobilization document that embraces conflict. There's a good guy and a bad guy. There are no good and bad guys in tech ethics manifestos. Everyone's part of the same community. Our second movement is even newer. The Tech Won't Build It campaign began with Google employees organizing against the Maven contract that supported targeted killing systems, and it picked up once employees in multiple companies, Microsoft, Salesforce, Amazon, Palantir, many more, started discovering their company's contracts with ICE. I was telling Marcus this earlier, but if you had told me 5 or 6 years ago that tech workers would be organizing across a variety of companies all over the world, I would have asked what you were smoking. I thought that was extraordinarily unlikely and it would absolutely never happen, and I very much believe in the power of labor. But nonetheless, here we are. It really is happening, and it really is different from the kind of design and ethics discussions that are happening elsewhere in the company. So workers staged protests and work stoppages within their companies. They composed open letters that illustrated the gap between corporate values and corporate practice. That was our main corpus in analyzing these movements. And they organized impressively in solidarity with each other and with other groups that are affected by their surveillance products. So Tech Won't Build It in the US works quite closely with like Con Mi Gente, which is an immigrant rights organizing group very much worried about border detention. Tech Won't Build It is broadly a movement for workplace democracy, holding that the people who make the tech should have a say in how it's used. And this is, again, distinct from ethical design's focus on expertise. Tech workers here claim a seat at the table not because of their qualifications, because they're the experts, but rather because of their strategic position in the production process. It's a statement of legitimacy, but it's also a threat, because they operate in the place that could shut down the machine. In contrast to ethical design, there is an explicit focus on reducing profits, or at least redirecting them away from war or ethnic cleansing, because you're already making enough money selling ads, and this other stuff might scare away new recruits and investors. So we saw today that these category machines that we call machine learning models can harm both the political process and the outcomes of that process. The dominant response to that has been an elite process to engineer an ethics that will take the harsh edges off those engineering problems. It's a live question, though. It's up for grabs. And I think that one of the advantages of taking this kind of sociological approach to ethics, just like a social critique of technology, is to show that it needn't be thus. That different moral projects are possible, and indeed many have deep roots in other abolitionist or labor organizing cultures that have been with us for centuries. Both technology and the ethics of technology are made by people, and thus can be made or remade by people. Thank you.